Hello, my name is Nathaniel Ashford, and today I am discussing the classic literature novel Animal Farm. Animal Farm, written by George Orwell and published on August 17th, 1945, is a story about a group of animals that decide to seize control of their farm. After getting fed up with their previous owner, Farmer Jones, the animals decide to perform a hostile takeover on the farm. After the revolt, life is good for a while. The animals believe that they made the right decision in kicking out their previous owners. But unfortunately, things don't stay that way. Two pigs, Napoleon and Snowball, decide that they deserve a little more power than the rest of the animals. The novel ends with the pigs exploiting the rest of the farm animals, just like their previous human owners, and even dressing up in human clothes and acting like the humans they hated so much. Now, Animal Farm is definitely a very thought-provoking novel, and there's definitely many subjects that I could cover. But for this podcast's purpose, what I'm looking at is how I can relate Animal Farm to the Holocaust. So first off, I'd like to put out some key evidence that relates Animal Farm to the mass genocide known as the Holocaust. So the first major piece of evidence that definitely would relate the Holocaust and Animal Farm is this notion that by kicking out the farmers, Farmer Jones and his family, that the animals' lives would improve by any amount. And essentially, it's a similar ideology that Hitler took and the Nazis took when it came to the Jews, that as soon as they got rid of the Jew problem, as they called it, then their lives would greatly improve and the life of Germany would be greatly improved. The next topic I'd like to cover is that of the Nazis and the pigs and how they're relatable. So essentially, both groups, the Nazis and the pigs, both had these brilliant leaders, very much strategists, you could call them, with these brainwashing speeches that were able to convince many of the animals that their lives would be better as long as they stuck with them. And, they promised all these high things, but unfortunately, as time grew on, animals came to realize too late that they weren't going to follow through with it. And so, to relate that to even modern times, it raises this question, which is, how often do we promise things and not follow through with it? It's a little bit of a food for thought. And so, the last key similarity I'd like to introduce is this idea that Hitler and Napoleon were both slowly changing the rules that were meant to keep them in check, and doing so very subtly to benefit themselves, and doing so slowly, in fact, that it was essentially desensitizing the rest of the animals and the rest of the Germans so that they were no longer surprised when these new rules were in fact enforced and ended up benefiting the Nazi Party, or in Animal Farm's case, the pigs. An example of this in Animal Farm is the Seven Commandments, which started off being fair for all animals, but then was slowly changed by the pigs, the only animals that knew how to read and write, to provide an advantage over the rest of the animals for the pigs. And for the Nazis, it was the fire in the Reichstag, which led to the civil rights of the German people to be curtailed, and thus silencing anyone who would speak out against Hitler or the Nazis. And so now I'd like to start pointing out the key differences between Animal Farm and the Holocaust. Now, the first point I'd like to hit is this idea that in the beginning, the pigs didn't really embody the same ideologies that they did later on in this novel. Instead, they followed the ideologies of the communists very closely, where essentially they believed that everything on the farm belonged to all the animals on the farm, and that the load and workload should be distributed evenly among the animals. And so essentially, by sharing a communal space, everybody worked just as hard and received the same treatment. And while this may not have been the case later on in the story, it is definitely something to take into consideration, especially considering that this varied greatly from the Nazi ideologies. So the next fact that differentiated the Holocaust and Animal Farm is the ending of Animal Farm. So the ending plays out where the pigs end up becoming the humans that they so greatly hated in the beginning and taking advantage of the other animals. Essentially, they did not have to pay for any of their consequences, and life was extremely good for the pigs while the rest of the animals suffered. Now, for the Holocaust, things were a little bit different. After Hitler died and the Nazi army defeated, many of the German civilians were marched out to concentration camps to see what they had been bystanders to. They witnessed the pain and suffering that the Jews had gone through and all the horrible crimes that the Nazis were committing on these people. Many of the civilians even had to go and bury the dead bodies that were at the concentration camps. So definitely a very different ending, where on one side, the party that was at fault did not have to pay for the consequences or see the consequences of their actions, while on the other side, not necessarily the party at fault, but the bystanders, and in many a case, bystanders can be just as at fault as the perpetrators, had to witness the results of their actions, or in this case, lack of action. Now we will look at the final differentiating factor before we move on to the conclusion. Now, aside from ridding Germany of the Jewish problem, as Hitler called it, his main plan was to essentially expand Germany's territory by going to war and taking over more land and more countries. And for the farm animals, the plan was much different. After taking control of the farm, the animals were looking to seclude themselves away from the rest of the world. And while this wasn't always possible, they pretty much succeeded in keeping as little contact as possible with the outside world. So it's two very different strategies, with one wanting to take over more land and more resources to better provide for the country, and the other wanting to separate themselves from the outside world and not push their luck any further. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the conclusion. As with any argumentative essay, the point I'm trying to prove here could be argued to the moon and back, and anything that I say here is truly only my opinion, and everybody else is entitled to their own. But still, the reason that we do this is so that it can provide a point of reference to anyone else that is interested in this subject. So here is my conclusion. Yes, Animal Farm is a story about animals, and yes, the animals did follow a communist ideology. But I believe that the similarities between the Holocaust and Animal Farm are too great to overlook. So whether or not it was the writer's intention, they both introduce very similar themes and very similar ideologies. And I think that Animal Farm could be a useful resource when teaching about the Holocaust. Thank you for listening to this short podcast about Animal Farm and the Holocaust.